Installing Windows Server 2008. Microsoft Windows 2008, it's the latest Windows Server operating system to date. Over the course of these videos, you're going to come to realize that Windows 2008 isn't just an incremental upgrade to its predecessor, Windows Server 2003. It's certainly a lot more than that. With its new features like Hyper-V, we have a streamlined server core version and much more, you're going to learn that it's streets ahead of any previous version of Windows. Now, Windows 2008 is available in quite a few different versions, although the likelihood of you using some of these editions listed here is probably going to be pretty much close to none for most of you listening. So firstly, we have a data center edition, which is really aimed at those extremely large corporations, you know, the ones that can afford those massive computers that the rest of us dream of having. This edition supports up to 64 CPUs and around 2 terabytes of memory. So that probably gives you an idea that it's not likely to be the one you're going to be running in your home lab. Now we have the Enterprise and Standard editions, which are quite similar for the most part, but the Enterprise edition here does support twice the number of CPUs than Standard does, and that's 8 CPUs instead of 4, which is what the Standard will support. Now the Enterprise also supports technologies like failover clustering, and as the name suggests, it's a bit more suited to the Enterprise, but a lot of people will choose to run with the Enterprise edition anyway. Now underneath Standard we have the Web edition of Windows 2008, which is designed for people that want to deploy a web server, and because of that it's limited with what it can do, but the trade-off is that it's cheaper than some of the other versions of Windows 2008. Now there are a couple of other versions of Windows 2008 listed here, such as the HPC edition, which is pretty much designed for supercomputers, and the Foundation edition at the bottom here, which is only sold by OEMs, so it's not so likely that you're going to use it. Now there's also a couple of other editions of Windows 2008 that don't come with Hyper-V, and that's something we're going to talk about in another video. But for the most part though, you're probably going to have a copy of either the Enterprise edition or the Standard edition, and you're going to find that the Enterprise edition here, this is the one that we're going to be using over the course of these videos. Now if you do have a different copy, don't worry, pretty much everything that we're going to do in these videos you're going to be able to do with the Standard edition anyway. So whichever version of Windows 2008 you do eventually decide to buy though, you're going to have roughly the same set of hardware requirements that you'll need to meet in order to install the product. So the minimum requirements to install and run Windows 2008 is you're going to need to have at least a 1 gigahertz CPU if you're installing the 32-bit edition of Windows 2008. Now if you're installing the 64-bit edition, you're going to need at least a 1.4 gigahertz CPU according to Microsoft. Now you're also going to need at least 512 megabytes of RAM, at least 20 gigs of hard disk space free for a 32-bit installation, and 32 gig for a 64-bit installation, and you're going to need a video card and monitor that's capable of running 800 by 600 resolution, and finally you're going to need things like a keyboard and a mouse. Now whilst a server with these low specifications will indeed install and run Windows 2008, logic will dictate to you that the memory should be more than 512 mega RAM, and will largely depend on what the server will end up doing. So if you're going to install SQL Server on it, then good luck with 512 mega RAM, you're going to want more. If it's going to be a file server, then you could possibly get away with that 512 meg, but realistically, I'd recommend that you shoot for around 1 gigabyte of RAM as the absolute minimum. Now, regarding your hard disk here, obviously the bigger the better in most cases, and RAID is always a good idea. And finally, the CPU, depending on what you're going to be using the server for, I think it should be sitting around the 2 gigahertz mark, and with dual and quad core systems around nowadays, that should be pretty easy to get some good grunt from even those entry-level CPUs. Anyway, those specs are the minimums as defined by Microsoft, so make sure that you have a server that exceeds them, especially in those areas I've just outlined, and you can begin enjoying Windows 2008. Okay, well, rather than making this a long, drawn-out video telling you all about the new features of Windows 2008, what we're going to do is we're going to press on, we're going to install the product, and we'll see what's new and how it can benefit you over the rest of this video series. And there's going to be a lot of videos in this series to watch, so you guys are going to be busy. Now, even though there are many ways that we could install Windows 2008, for example, we could use things like Windows deployment services to install Windows, that's one way. We could use third-party tools to clone an existing installation, that's another way. But we're going to go grassroots here, and we're going to install Windows 2008 the old-fashioned way by putting the DVD in the drive and installing the operating system manually. And in fact, we're going to talk about using other deployment methods in other videos anyway. So I've gone ahead and I've placed the Windows 2008 DVD in my drive, and I've started up my computer, and the first thing that Windows 2008 Setup is going to do is load some files that Setup needs to begin the installation, and it's going to boot into the GUI mode that you see right here. So Setup here is going to require us to define what sort of language we want to use to install Windows 2008, the time and the currency format, and what type of keyboard layout we're using. Now you can choose whatever fits your location from this list here, although the defaults are most likely going to be the correct choices anyway, so we're simply going to click Next. And now we're ready to install Windows 2008 on our server. Now if you like, you can read some built-in information about things that you should know before installing Windows 2008, although this help file here really details only obvious things like making sure that you've got your Windows license key handy and things like that, but you can feel free to read it in your own time. If you're currently having problems with a previous Windows 2008 operating system, you can click on the repair link here, and that's going to bring up a new window that allows you to attempt to repair Windows 2008. Now do take note though that this will only repair Windows 2008 and Windows Vista and not any older versions of Windows. And since this is a new computer that I'm installing Windows 2008 on, you'll notice here that I don't actually have any previous versions listed. So we're going to cancel this now by clicking on the little X in the top right corner of this window, and we'll begin installing Windows Server 2008 by clicking on Install Now. Alright, now once you've gotten this far in your installation of Windows 2008, if at any time you happen to need access to a command prompt, you can hold down the Shift key on your keyboard and hit F10, and you're going to see a command prompt window pop up. This will only work after you've clicked that Install button. Alright, well we'll type in Exit to close this command prompt, and at this point here, we'll need to select the version of Windows 2008 that we want to install. Obviously, what you choose here is going to depend on a couple of things. Firstly, what is it that you plan on doing with this operating system, and what licenses do you have? Now, if you only have a license for, say, the standard edition of Windows Server 2008, then that, of course, is going to be what you're going to choose here. So your decision would be made for you. But if you've got licenses for all of these versions of Windows 2008, then the decision will likely come down to what you plan on using this operating system for. Now, if it's a file server in a small company, again, the standard edition would probably be fine. In fact, it'll probably be fine for pretty much anything. But if you have requirements for other technologies like failover clustering, or you need support for more than 32 gig of RAM or more than 4 CPUs, maybe things like hot swap memory, then you're going to want to go with the Enterprise Edition. So once you've decided which edition you want to install and chosen whether that's going to be a full installation of Windows or a Server Core Edition, and we'll be covering Server Core Editions later on in this series, so if you don't know what Server Core is yet, don't worry, we're going to get to that later on. And in fact, I'd suggest that if you don't know what Server Core is, then chances are you don't want to install it anyway. So I'm going to select a full installation of the Enterprise Edition of Windows 2008, so we'll select that and we'll click Next. Now we'll need to read and agree with the license terms and conditions that Microsoft has set out for Windows Server 2008 Enterprise Edition. So we'll check the box here indicating that we accept those terms, and we'll click Next. Okay, so do we want to upgrade a previous Windows operating system or install a new one? Well, as you can see here, since this is a new computer, I don't actually have another copy of Windows installed to upgrade, so that's grayed out. We've only got the one choice anyway. So we'll choose the custom option to install a new version of Windows 2008, and then we'll need to choose where we want to install it. Now on my computer here, I only have a single hard disk, so I'm going to leave the default here to install it on disk 0, which will then become my C drive. But if you'd like to perform some additional actions on your disks, like extend them or maybe format them before you install Windows 2008, you can click on the Advanced Drive Options hyperlink here, and here you'll have the ability to modify your drives and your partitions before you go ahead and start the installation. And note that on the left here, you could also load any drivers that are required by your drives or maybe your drive controller if it's not already recognized by Windows 2008. So if you don't happen to see any of your drives listed up here, then you probably need a driver disk from the vendor of your hardware, and then you can click this link and then load those files in. So I'm happy to leave my default drive as it is, so I'm going to click Next, and then Windows 2008 will begin copying the files it needs to my hard drive, and it will start installing the new operating system. So as you'd expect, this is going to take a while because we are installing an entire operating system here from scratch, so I'm going to pause the video and we'll return once setup has copied all the files it needs to our hard drive, and again it's going to ask us for some input. Alright, well, we're back and Windows 2008 has been installed, so now we'll need to enter in a password for the local administrator's account. So we'll click on OK, and we'll enter in a password and we'll type it in again just to confirm we typed it in OK, and we'll hit enter, and we can see that our password has been changed, so we'll click OK, and that's going to fire up the Windows Server 2008 desktop. And as you can see, we're in. Windows 2008 has been successfully installed. Now that Windows Server 2008 has been installed, it's most likely that you're going to want to configure a few things like the host name of this server, its IP address if you want it to have a static one, and you might also want to add it to a domain. So let's go and take a look at how we can get these initial tasks completed. And Microsoft is already ahead of us here, because since this is the first time that we're using this freshly installed operating system, the first thing you'll notice is this initial configuration task window, which of course is designed to remind you of the things that you probably need to do to this server. But let me just say before we get started with configuring some of the things that you see here, if you're an experienced campaigner and you've been around Windows Server for a while, you don't need to use this initial configuration task window to configure Windows Server. You can go about your business and do it by accessing the tools directly and not from this screen. But this screen is a pretty good idea by Microsoft, as it puts all of those things that you'd normally do for a new server and it drops them all on this one screen here so you don't forget to do them. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a few of the most important things here in this video, and the other things we're going to cover in future videos. Alright, so at the top, the first option we have is to set the time zone, which as you can see on the right here defaults to using Pacific time. Now if Pacific time does happen to be the correct time zone for where this server is going to live, then of course you don't have to do anything. But if it's not the correct time zone, then you'll want to click on the hyperlink here, and that's going to fire up the date and time window where you can just change these things. Now if you do want to get to this window directly, by the way, let's just cancel this, then you can simply right click on the time down here in the system tray and then choose adjust date and time, and that's going to open up the exact same window. So if we click on the change date and time button, we're able to use this calendar picker here to select the correct date, and we can choose the correct time as well, and then click OK. Now also we're able to change our time zone as well, and then choose the correct time zone from the list here. Again, click OK, and OK one more time. Now our second step here is to configure networking, so we'll click the hyperlink here, and that's going to open up the network connections folder, and you're going to see any network interfaces right here. Now these network interfaces are going to default to using a dynamic or DHCP IP address, and we can tell that it's doing that because it's showing that it's in the process of identifying a network. But using DHCP may or may not be what you want. In a lot of cases, since this is a server that we're dealing with, a static IP address is more likely to be what you want. So really, you need to decide if it's a static or a dynamic address that you want to have. If it's dynamic, then you don't need to do anything. You could skip this step entirely. If it's static, then you'll need to set a static IP address manually. Now to do that, we'll just right-click on our network interface, and we'll choose the bottom option, Properties. Now in Windows 2008, we have IPv6 and IPv4 support. But for the purposes of this video, we're only going to configure IPv4, and we'll take a look at IPv6 in a future video. So to edit this, we can either double click on IPv4, or we could select it and choose Properties. Alright, well, here we can see that this interface is trying to obtain an IP address automatically. And at the bottom, it's also attempting to obtain an IP address for a DNS server automatically as well. So currently, it's looking for a DHCP server on the network that can give it this information. But we want to do this manually, so we're going to choose this radio button here to use the following IP addresses, and we're going to need to enter in an IP address for this machine. So I'm going to enter in 10.32.0.78, and I'm going to hit Tab on my keyboard, and that's going to fill in the subnet mask for me automatically. I'll hit Tab again, and in the IP address field for my default gateway, I'm going to enter in my default gateway, which is 10.32.0.1. And now down here for the DNS address, I'm going to enter in the DNS address of at least one DNS server in our network. So for me, that's going to be 10.32.0.2. And if you have another DNS server, you can enter that one in as well. So I'll enter in 10.32.0.1. And if you don't fully understand DNS or IP addressing at this stage, that's okay, because we're going to talk about this stuff later on in other videos anyway. So for now, we'll just simply click OK, and then we'll click Close. And now we can see right down the bottom here that this little icon here, the one that looks like two computer monitors, now has a world globe appear over the top of it. And this tells you visually that this server now has an active connection to the internet. And up here for our network interface card, we can see that that's now changed from identifying, and it now says network. Alright, well, we're done here, so we can close this window, and we'll go back here to our initial configuration tasks window, where the next step is to provide a computer name and a domain. So we'll click the link, and we can see that currently right here, this machine has been assigned a random name, which we don't in all honesty have to change this, but it's certainly not a name that we're going to remember easily, so you will want to change it. So we'll click on the Change button, and we can perform these two changes at once. Firstly, we'll give this new computer a name, and you can call it pretty much whatever you like. I'm just going to give it a name of Winstructor01. And again, we don't have to join this machine to a domain at all. We could leave it at a work group if we like, but it is likely that this machine will need to join a domain if you're putting it into a corporate or a business environment. So we will add it to a domain. We'll check the button here next to domain, and we'll need to enter in the name of the domain that we want to join. Now, my domain here is called winstructorlab.com. So we'll enter that in and we'll click OK. But by the way though, if you don't yet have a domain, and this is going to be the first machine in your network, or maybe it's going to be your domain controller, then just leave this here at a work group and we'll build a domain controller in a later video. And that'll be built upon a default installation of Windows 2008, just like we have right now. So we're going to join this to our domain though, and we can see that it has already found my domain controller. So we'll need to enter in the username and password of an account that has the permissions to add this server to our domain. So I'm going to use the administrator account, and I'll need to enter in a password for that account if I can remember it correctly, and we'll click OK. Alright, well, we've successfully joined the domain. And by the way, if you do happen to get an error here and there aren't any physical network problems, then it's most likely to be because of one of two reasons. Either you don't have the DNS server IP address in the network interface listed correctly, or you didn't supply the correct username and password. But as you can see, we're good, so we'll click OK. And we will be asked to restart this machine, by the way. So we'll click OK again and we'll click Close. But for now, I'm going to click Restart Later, and we'll reboot this server in a moment when we're good and ready. So back to our initial configuration task, the next step down here is to configure automatic updating and feedback. So we'll click the link here, and I must admit up front that I'm not a fan of choosing the automatic settings just like Microsoft suggest and recommend. So I'm going to choose the bottom option to manually configure these settings. And this will bring up a new window like you see here, where our first option is to configure Windows Automatic Updating, which is currently set to not configured, so we'll click the Change Setting button. Now, since Windows is a popular target for attackers, since obviously the vast majority of the world's using it, it stands to reason that Microsoft release updates to Windows which can be downloaded by using this automatic update feature, and that'll update your server. Since this is a server though, and most likely it's going to be part of a domain network, it's probably not likely that you'll need to configure Windows updating here, because it's more likely, at least in larger companies, that you're going to have a Windows Software Update Services server that takes care of this for you. And we're going to talk about this service later on in another video, and we'll show you how to set it up. But that said though, you might only have one or two servers in your company, and you'd prefer to let Microsoft automatically update them. So if that sounds like that's going to suit your needs better, then you could just select this Install Updates Automatically, the recommended option, and you can walk away. But just be aware though that sometimes updates can break more than they fix. Sometimes they could introduce more problems and new problems that you didn't have before the update. Now that sort of thing doesn't really happen very often though, but be aware anything's possible. So you might want to have a look at one of the other options here instead, perhaps just to download the updates, but let me choose whether to install them. Or perhaps just to check for updates, so it'll tell me that there are updates, and then I'll be the one to decide whether or not I want to download them. Or of course we could just choose not to use Windows Update at all, and never check if there's any new updates. Now look, whatever you choose here is going to depend on how you want your updates handled. If you do have a Windows Software Update Services server in your company, then you're going to go ahead and use that. You'll use group policy to configure this machine that we're on right now to point to that server and grab updates from your Windows Software Update Services server. Now, if that doesn't sound like you, then at the very least, you should be choosing to check for updates and then let me decide if I want to install them or not. But not doing anything's a bad idea, since you'll want to keep your server up to date, which in turn should mean it's more secure. So I'm going to set this server to check for updates, but not to download them until I decide. And down the bottom here, we may as well check this box to include recommended updates as well, and that might include things like updated drivers for our hardware, as well as updates that mightn't be released to fix any bugs or security holes, but to provide additional functionality and things like that. So being notified about those, that's a pretty good idea. All right, well, we'll click OK. The next step here is to configure Windows error reporting, and this is where we can tell Windows to send Microsoft details about what's happening on our system when we encounter an error, and application crashes and things like that. Now the deal is that Microsoft will supposedly collate all of these error reports and possibly be able to fix them if enough people are experiencing the same problem. Now personally, I'm not a big fan of this type of thing because I don't like sending my information about my systems to outsiders, particularly data from my production systems. Although I will say that Microsoft do tell you that no personal data will be sent, but anyway, we can click on the change setting button and then choose what you want to do here. But I'm going to set mine to the option at the bottom here. I don't want to participate, and don't ask me again. But if you do want to participate, then you can choose one of the other three options. So we'll click OK, and the last option we have here is similar but different to the previous option in that this one is asking permission to send data about your system to Microsoft in order to help them understand what sort of systems out there in the world are running Windows 2008. Well, again, I'm going to set this to no and click on OK. All right, we're done here, so we'll click Close. Now we could skip download and install updates as that relates to our automatic updating anyway. Although we will see these updates soon when Windows 2008 checks to see if there are any. And based on our settings, it's only going to check for these updates, and it'll be up to us to decide whether we want to download and install them later. Now, we could also skip the rest of these options here for now. You see these roles and features we'll be talking about in other videos, remote desktop and the Windows firewall, they'll also be covered in other videos. So the last thing that I'm going to look at in this video is entering in our license key and activating Windows. But first, we're going to have to restart this server. So we'll click Close, and we'll go and restart our system. Now we could do that here by simply clicking on this hyperlink, or we could go through our Start menu if we like. So I'll pause the video here. I'm going to reboot this machine, and we'll be back in just a moment. Alright, we're back. This server has been restarted, and you will notice now that in this initial configuration tasks window, the settings that you can see here on the right hand side have now changed to reflect the fact that we've updated our time zone, our IP address, our host name, and we've added this server to a domain and configured our update settings as well. So since we're now done with this window, I'm going to check this box at the bottom here not to show it anymore each time we log on, and then we can close it. Now when we do close it, this is going to open up a new console called the Server Manager console, something that we'll be using a lot in later videos. But for now, we don't need it, so I'm going to close it. But don't worry, it will open up automatically the next time we restart this server, or we could just click on this grey icon here down the bottom and we'll get it back that way. But instead, what we're going to do now is we're going to click on Start. We'll right click on Computer and choose Properties. Now right down the bottom of this window here, you can see that Windows isn't activated at this stage. So if we don't do anything, in 3 days, Windows 2008 is going to try and activate itself with Microsoft anyway. Now that's going to be a problem though, because since with my version of Windows, it hasn't even requested a license key yet. So we will need to enter one in. So we're going to click on Change Product Key. And here we'll need to enter in our Windows Server 2008 product key, which of course is the 25-digit key that's been supplied with your copy of Windows 2008. Now, since a license key belongs to the owner, I'm not going to show my license key here for the world to see. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video, I'll enter in my license code here, and then I'll click Next, and we'll resume recording once we're done. Okay, well our license code has been entered and accepted, and this will now automatically try and activate our system with Microsoft to verify that we do in fact have a genuine licensed copy of Windows. Alright, we're done. We're now activated with Microsoft and this server is ready to go and ready to be configured further with other software, ready to turn it into whatever you want. So if it's going to be a domain controller, it's ready to go. If you want it to be a DHCP server, well, that's fine too. A file server? No problem. You can now pretty much get going with whatever you need this server to be. So now that Windows Server 2008 is installed, we're going to move forward in this series of videos and we're going to take a good, detailed look at what Windows 2008 has to offer, and we'll look at configuring the various roles and features. So we hope you've enjoyed this video and would like to thank you for watching.